At 400 meters, the last photon of sunlight dies. Not fades, not softens into something your eyes could adjust to. Dies. The final surviving wavelength of visible light, a thin, cold, barely there blue, collapses into nothing. And what replaces it is a darkness that has existed since before the first fish. A darkness that the surface world has never once interrupted. A darkness so complete that the human brain, when submerged in it, stops trusting itself. And here's the true part that sounds fake. The animals that live at this depth built their entire bodies around that single fact. Not around food, not around temperature, not around pressure. Around the disappearance of light. The boundary where the sun stops being relevant, where photons stop being information, became the most powerful evolutionary pressure in this part of the ocean. And the biological arms race that erupted in response to it produced some of the strangest, most sophisticated, most quietly mind-bending creatures on Earth. So what actually happens to light as it descends into the ocean? And what does it mean for the life that has to survive the moment it runs out? Why is 400 meters the threshold where Earth's rules start to break down? And how do you hide in a world where the only light is the light you carry on your own body? Picture the descent, but this time, watch the light. At the surface, sunlight is broad spectrum. Every wavelength arrives simultaneously. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, the full visible range, plus ultraviolet and infrared on either side. The ocean is lit the way a room is lit with all the lights on. Warm, complete. Everything is visible in true color. Now drop 10 meters. Red is already gone, not dimmed, absorbed. Water molecules strip red wavelengths out of the light column with remarkable efficiency, converting them to heat. 10 meters down, if you were holding a red object, it would look black. Color is not an intrinsic property of the deep ocean. It is a privilege of proximity to the sun. Drop to 30 meters. Orange disappears. The water is now lit in yellows, greens, and blues. The warm half of the spectrum is over. Drop to 50 meters. Yellow pulls out of the equation. You're down to greens and blues. If you've ever seen underwater photographs from this depth, the ones where everything has that luminous, slightly unreal cyan quality, this is why. It's not a filter. It's all that's left of sunlight. Drop to 100 meters. Green fades into background noise. What remains now is blue. Only blue. A single compressed band of the visible spectrum, the wavelength that water absorbs last and most reluctantly, still pushing down through the column with the faint persistence of a signal trying to maintain contact. This is the edge of the photic zone, the region where photosynthesis is still theoretically possible, where a handful of photons still reach enough density to power a chemical reaction. Below this, even that purpose ends. Drop to 200 meters. The blue is still here, but it is no longer illumination. It is presence, a color without a source. Cold, directionless, arriving from nowhere and going nowhere. This is where your visual cortex begins to disagree with your instruments. You cannot read by it. You cannot navigate by it. But it is technically there. Drop to 400 meters. Gone. In all but the clearest, most pristine tropical ocean water, the kind found in the South Pacific Gyre, far from any coastline or river plume, blue light does not survive 400 meters. In most of the world's ocean, the transition to functional darkness happens somewhere between 200 and 400 meters, depending on water clarity, season, and particle load. But 400 meters is the ceiling, the outer limit, the most generous estimate for how far the sun's influence reaches. Below 400 meters in most of the ocean, no photon of sunlight has ever arrived. The zone between 200 and 1,000 meters carries a name, the mesopelagic zone. Scientists call it the Twilight Zone, which is technically accurate. It receives the last suggestion of light at its upper boundary and delivers total darkness at its lower one. But twilight softens what is actually happening here. It implies a gentle transition, a dusk. This is not dusk. This is a wall. And on the far side of that wall, the rules of biology stop looking like anything you learned in school. Before we meet the animals, it's worth standing at 400 meters for a moment and taking inventory of what else has changed. Because light is not the only system that collapses here. Pressure at 400 meters is approximately 40 atmospheres, 40 times the weight of the air column above sea level, pressing against every surface in every direction simultaneously. This is not an abstract number. It is the reason no recreational diving equipment functions at this depth. It is the reason the gases dissolved in blood begin to behave unpredictably at shallower depths. Nitrogen narcosis sets in well before you reach this point. The human body was not designed for 400 meters. Nothing about our physiology is compatible with it. Temperature has undergone a transformation by this point. Above 200 meters, ocean temperature varies seasonally, warmer near the surface in summer, cooler in winter, mixed by storms and currents. Below the thermocline, a sharp transition layer that typically occurs between 100 and 300 meters. The water stabilizes into the cold that defines the deep ocean year-round, somewhere between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius, depending on latitude. At 400 meters, you are almost certainly below the thermocline. The seasonal world has ended. The temperature you feel here in January is the temperature you would feel in July. The temperature you feel here today is the temperature felt by the first organisms that colonized this depth hundreds of millions of years ago. Sound behaves differently here too. The mesopelagic zone sits within the SOFAR channel, the sound fixing and ranging channel, a depth range where the ocean's acoustic properties create a natural waveguide. Sound produced here bends back toward the channel instead of dispersing in all directions. Under the right conditions, a loud sound made in the SOFAR channel can travel thousands of kilometers before dissipating. The ocean at this depth is acoustically amplified in a way the surface never is. So here is the environment at 400 meters. No light, crushing pressure, near freezing stable temperature, a layer of unusual acoustic sensitivity, and a food supply that arrives exclusively from above, the trickle of marine snow drifting down from the sunlit world. No photosynthesis is possible here. Nothing here produces its own energy from sunlight. Every calorie consumed at 400 meters is a calorie that was originally manufactured at the surface and then fell. This is the stage. Now meet the cast. The Twilight Zone is not empty. This is the most important correction you can make to your mental model of the deep ocean. It is the largest inhabited zone on Earth by volume. The mesopelagic ocean, 200 to 1,000 meters deep, spanning every ocean basin on the planet, represents a staggering volume of water, more living space than all terrestrial ecosystems combined. And it is not sparsely populated. In terms of sheer numbers of individual animals, the Twilight Zone may be home to more fish than any other region of the ocean. They are just invisible, and most of them have never been seen alive. The most numerous fish you have probably never thought about is cyclothone, the bristlemouth fish, a slender, translucent, finger-length creature with a disproportionately large mouth lined with needle-like teeth. Cyclothone may be the most numerically abundant vertebrate on Earth, not abundant in the ocean, on Earth. More individual animals
The 400-meter deep ocean Twilight Zone. Water here is alien, cold, and completely inhospitable to light.
They live in the mesopelagic zone in numbers that defy easy comprehension. Scientists estimate the global population in the hundreds of trillions, and almost no one knows they exist. Then there are the lanternfish, family Myctophidae, small, silvery, bearing rows of photophores along their flanks like embedded LEDs. They may account for 65% of all deep-sea fish biomass. They form a significant component of the deep scattering layer we explored in a previous episode, the living horizon that early sonar operators mistook for a rising seafloor. Every night, they ascend toward the surface to feed on zooplankton. Every dawn, they descend back past 400 meters to hide in the dark. They have been making this commute for millions of years. There are the hatchetfish, Argyroplecus, whose bodies are laterally compressed to near translucence, shaped like the head of an axe, with enormous tubular eyes permanently angled upward. Those eyes are not looking for prey. They are doing something more sophisticated. They are watching the faint light above, measuring its intensity and angular distribution with a precision that rivals modern scientific instruments. Why? Because of a problem that, once you understand it, reframes everything about life at this depth. There are viperfish, Chauliatus, with fangs too long to fit inside their own mouths, hinged jaws that open at near perpendicular angles, and a bioluminescent lure dangling from a modified dorsal spine directly above their head. The lure pulses. The darkness around it is absolute. Anything drawn to light in a lightless world finds the lure first and the teeth second. And there are siphonophores, colonial animals, not one organism but a superorganism, a chain of hundreds of genetically identical individuals called zooids, each one specialized for a specific function. Some sting, some swim, some digest, some reproduce, none of them capable of living independently. Preia dubia, a siphonophore found in the Twilight Zone, can reach 40 to 50 meters in length, making it one of the longest animals on Earth. It drifts almost invisibly in the water column, a nearly transparent thread of coordinated biology, waiting for the impact of anything that swims into it. These animals are not unusual specimens in a sparse ecosystem. They are the dominant, abundant, structurally important fauna of the largest habitat on the planet. And what shapes almost everything about their biology, their eyes, their bodies, their behaviors, their chemistry, is the problem of light. Here is the problem, stated plainly. At 400 meters, you are in functional darkness. Below you, absolute black. Above you, a memory of blue, faint, diffuse, directionless in the clearest of waters, entirely absent in murkier ones. The only reliable light in your environment is the light that other animals are producing on their own bodies. This creates a specific and lethal vulnerability. If you are an animal swimming at 400 meters and anything moves between you and that faint remnant of blue light above, if any object occupies the water column between your eyes and the surface, you will see it, not in detail, not in color, but as a silhouette, a shadow moving against the last light. And in a world where everything is trying to eat everything else, a silhouette is a death sentence. This is called the silhouette problem, and it is the single most dominant evolutionary pressure in the Twilight Zone. Every animal here is permanently backlit from above, even in near total darkness. The faint gradient of light from the surface creates an asymmetry between up and down that a sensitive eye can exploit. A predator below you, looking upward, can detect your outline against the lighter water above. Your body interrupts the gradient. You become visible by the simple act of existing in the water column. The response to this problem, evolved independently across dozens of unrelated animal lineages at this depth, is one of the most elegant biological solutions in the ocean. Make your belly glow. Counter-illumination is the strategy. Produce bioluminescent light from photophores on your ventral surface, your underside, at an intensity and wavelength that precisely matches the faint downwelling light coming from above. When a predator looks up at you from below, instead of seeing a dark silhouette against lighter water, it sees nothing. Your bioluminescence fills in your own shadow. You become optically continuous with the water around you. You disappear not by hiding, but by becoming indistinguishable from the background. The hatchetfish, with its upward-pointing tubular eyes measuring incoming light, is monitoring the intensity above it in real time, adjusting the output of its ventral photophores constantly to match the changing light field as clouds pass, as depth shifts, as water clarity changes. It is running a continuous calculation, an active camouflage system, not a fixed pattern, a dynamic one, responding to environmental input the way a display responds to a signal. 76% of all fish in the mesopelagic zone are bioluminescent. 3 out of every 4 animals in this part of the ocean carry their own light, not to see, but to manage visibility, to control whether they can be seen, to participate
the
in an
400-meter deep ocean Twilight Zone,
that has
water
been running
cold
for
and
hundreds of
alien,
millions of
the
years,
last layer
in the
touched
exact
by
zone
dying
where
sunlight.
runs out. The animals here are not passively adapted to darkness. They are actively engineering their relationship with it. Let's step back for a moment and take the scale seriously. The mesopelagic zone covers the entire global ocean. It begins at 200 meters and ends around 1,000 meters, and it wraps around a planet that is 71% water. The total volume of the mesopelagic ocean is somewhere in the vicinity of 330 million cubic kilometers. No terrestrial biome, no forest, no grassland, no desert comes close to occupying this kind of three-dimensional space, and the biomass contained within it is staggering. Estimates for the total mass of mesopelagic fish alone run between 1 and 10 billion metric tons, larger than the global commercial fish catch of the entire surface ocean. The zooplankton, the gelatinous animals, the microbial communities, the crustaceans, add them all, and the Twilight Zone may contain the largest concentration of animal life on Earth. We have sampled a fraction of it. Most of what we know about Twilight Zone fauna comes from net trawls, dragging a mesh bag through the water column and examining what you catch. But nets destroy fragile gelatinous animals. Nets miss creatures that swim fast enough to avoid them. Nets give you a statistical sample, not a census. When ROVs first started filming the mesopelagic zone in real time, scientists kept encountering species they had never caught in nets, in numbers their models hadn't predicted. The Twilight Zone is empirically larger, richer, and more complex than our data currently represents. And it matters enormously, not just as an ecosystem to be curious about, but as a mechanism that the entire planet depends on. The biological pump runs through here. Every night, billions of lanternfish and other migratory animals ascend from 400 meters toward the surface, feed on carbon-rich zooplankton, and descend again before dawn. In doing so, they physically transport carbon, packaged inside their bodies in their fecal pellets. In the carbon dioxide they respire at depth, from the productive surface zone down past the thermocline, past the reach of seasonal overturning currents into the stable deep, where it cannot easily return to the atmosphere. This process, called active transport by diel vertical migration, is estimated to move between 2 and 5 billion metric tons of carbon into the deep ocean every year. It is a significant fraction of the total biological carbon pump. It runs silently, invisibly, every single night, driven by animals the size of your finger performing a commute of several hundred meters each way in total darkness. The Twilight Zone is not background, it is infrastructure. And here is what ties this back to the story we have been building across this entire series. Every depth we have visited, the 700-meter scattering, layer the 700-meter oxygen minimum zone, where the vampire squid lives, the 50-meter abyss where Ostax worms dismantle whale bones, the 500-meter Hadal plains where plastic now arrives embedded in marine snow. Every single one of those environments is downstream from the Twilight Zone. Downstream physically, because marine snow originates in the Twilight Zone. The bodies of mesopelagic animals that die and sink, the fecal pellets they produce, the discarded mucus-feeding webs of gelatinous zooplankton, the carbon transported by their nightly migrations. All of it passes through or originates from the 200 to 1,000 meter layer before it descends further. Downstream ecologically, because the Twilight Zone is the intermediary, the processing layer between the sunlit surface and the true abyss. It is the place where surface world energy gets repackaged, concentrated, and redistributed into the formats that deeper ecosystems can use. And downstream in terms of consequence, because everything we identified in the previous episode as a contaminant arriving at 5,500 meters first passed through here. The microplastics that descend inside fecal pellets, the pollutants that bioaccumulate through mesopelagic fish before passing further down the food chain. The Twilight Zone is not just a habitat. It is a transit corridor, a processing layer, a membrane between the world we can see and the world we cannot. What happens at 400 meters does not stay at 400 meters. Here is the reframe. We draw a boundary at the ocean surface and call everything above it the real world, the productive world, the world that feeds us, the world that weather touches and satellites can photograph. Everything below it is the deep, mysterious, remote, relevant mainly to specialists. But that framing misses something fundamental. The boundary at 400 meters is a more meaningful threshold than the boundary at the surface. At the surface, the transition from air to water is physically dramatic but ecologically continuous. Coastal food webs connect the two directly. Nutrients cross the interface constantly. The surface ocean is still powered by the same star that powers everything above it. The surface ocean and the surface land share a sun. At 400 meters, the sun ends. The rules change. The physics of perception, locomotion, energy, and survival are so different below this line that the organisms who live here evolved separately from everything above it for so long that they no longer share a sensory world with the animals at the surface. They do not see color. They do not experience seasons. They do not feel the difference between night and day, except through the faint chemical signals and acoustic cues from the migrations that pass through them. They live in a place that runs on completely different operating principles. A place where the primary challenge is not finding food or avoiding temperature extremes. It is managing visibility, managing light, manufacturing light, using light as a weapon, a disguise, a lure, a signal, all with photons that the sun never delivered. The bristlemouth fish performing a counter-illumination shimmer in the water column is not doing something exotic. It is solving the oldest problem in its world with the only tool its world provides. It is managing darkness the way every animal at this depth has learned to manage darkness, not by fighting it, not by fleeing from it, but by understanding it so completely that the darkness itself becomes a resource. And there are hundreds of trillions of them down there doing this right now. The Twilight Zone is not where life gets sparse and strange before the real darkness begins. It is where life had its most rigorous conversation with physics, and won. If this series is giving you a real map of the ocean, layer by layer, pressure by pressure, creature by creature, then 400 meters is the hinge. It's the depth where the familiar world of sunlight and color becomes a relic, and the alien world built on bioluminescence and pressure and darkness begins. Everything below this point in the series, the oxygen minimum zones, the abyssal plains, the whale falls, the Hadal trenches, lives in the shadow cast by the Twilight Zone. They are fed by it. They are connected through it. They are downstream of the moment light ends. If you want to keep descending, keep mapping the real ocean, the full ocean, the ocean that exists whether we acknowledge it or not. Hit like and subscribe. Next episode, we're going back below the Twilight Zone and looking at something that sounds like geology but is actually alive. Hydrothermal vents, cracks in the seafloor that pour superheated, chemically saturated water into the cold abyss, and the ecosystems that built themselves entirely around heat and chemistry, with no sunlight, no marine snow, no biological pump required. Life that is completely independent of the sun. It sounds impossible. Every bit of it is real.